Ja, guten Morgen. Als wir diesen Vortrag im Januar
So when we submitted this in January, we didn't know how current this would be, but was clear that it would be very related to current politics. So I've been spending a lot of time in far-right extremist groups for years now, and I've noticed a lot of things in addition to plans for attacks or instructions for how to build bombs. People started complaining about their teachers or their homework. And so here is a very increasingly things like this, like an obviously underage person showing like clear right-wing signals. That's not something that just I noticed, but there were actually searches of several homes recently, and that's also something, So that was 2023, but we already published a report in 2022 where we warned that right-wing extremists were getting younger and younger. At the time, we were a bit more alone in warning about that, but today it's very clear that these are not lone wolves or single incidents. Even the Agency for the Protection of the Constitution in Brandenburg warns about young Nazis. And also the Berlin Agency for the Protection of the Constitution has started a surveillance project to keep an eye on far-right online culture. This headline might be very telling. Originally, they thought it was like an online phenomenon, but then a wave of violence followed, and so some people might still seem to be surprised in the year 2025 that things don't just happen online but then also enter meat space. And the Federal Criminal Agency also warns about far-right youth groups. We also have numbers, for example, in Saxonia-Anhaltina there has been an increase in incidents of far-right violence. And this is not simply a German problem. For example, in the UK, the head of MI5 said that the far-right extremism is one of the reasons, one of the causes for staggering surge in children linked to terror plots. And we also see this in other numbers. For example, when we look at the numbers for the European election in 2024, the AfD made huge gains with young people, and also in the federal election this year among 18 to 24-year-olds, the AfD gained amongst those people. And when we look at this more closely, we see that the 18 to 24-year-olds is not where the AfD got the most largest percentage of votes, but where their votes increased the most. We see the same problem in the study on the center of society. So it's 18 to 34. That's not exactly youth. But for example, support for dictatorship, diminishing the importance of National Socialism, these are like significant numbers for young people. And then also the authoritarianism study from Leipzig finds similar issues among young people. And so this kind of puts to death an old theory about how right-wing extremism is dying out, and because it's just the old people and young people will be progressive. And so if we go back to this, we can see that like this is clearly not a hypothesis that's even remotely valid. Rather, there's actually quite an issue with young people who are essentially turning into a right-wing threat or danger. And so where is this danger coming from? Who is this danger coming from? So yeah, some people might still remember the razzias and searches from the last weeks, which were due to suspicions of a far-right organization that was in response to a youth group that had radicalized itself over the last year. And that was especially concerning because many of the people who were arrested were between 14 and 18 years old, or rather one was 18 years old and the others were younger than 18. That's definitely a trend that matches our experiences over the last few years, that we observe extremely fast radicalization among young people. And there's like a tendency that we've noticed is like the increasingly self-confident neo-Nazi scene that especially established itself last year. There are new neo-Nazi youth groups, such as like the German youth, but also might sometimes have like local references in their name, or groups like Obstorium, which is active around Bautzen, that like directly target certain groups that they have not been able to reach in the past, such as far-right women. What we also notice is that the perpetrators are often underage, primarily male, and social media are a really important part of this whole thing as like a tool for putting yourself, presenting yourself, and for recruiting and for radicalization. And so, yeah, like whether like these really exist in, if like a social media account really corresponds to like an existing group is something that you need to see, like you need to check or see in like respective locations. But they put up, for example, like pictures that really worship like this violent aesthetic, and you can also see that there's like this cross-platform radicalization, like different profiles then have links to other platforms such as Instagram profiles with links to Telegram groups that have like more radical content where you create like a sense of belonging and like you increase the speed of radicalization. And increasing protests against pride events. Christopher Street Days has something that has increased. That's something that we really saw in the last year. We published an analysis of this. We counted 27 far-right anti-pride protests in German cities. The largest was in Bautzen, but it's clearly, like, it's definitely not just a simply East German phenomenon, but across Germany there were attacks on CSD events in Berlin. It was possible to prevent an attack on a CSD. There's one case where leftist protesters were attacked by neo-Nazis when they were traveling to a protest, and we definitely saw a lot of mobilization via social media. That, too, is something that continues to this day. If we just look forward to this day, militant and willing to commit violence, these are groups that are mobilizing for anti-Pride, anti-CSD protests next month, for example, in Pforzheim, but also in some cases with a lot of like advance notice in 3 months. Unfortunately, we see very little visible restraints for these far-right groups on social media. Rather, we see that they are able to establish like solid networks and structures. And to understand that a bit better, just a brief view into how they developed. So they were protests essentially serve as a space for action, for confrontation, but also as like self-confirmation. There's sometimes support from the existing organized neo-Nazi scene, but it also is about kind of presenting yourself in social media in a way that signals self-confidence. That's something that we hadn't seen so far. Previously, it was more the case that these groups really cared about protecting and maintaining their like anonymity. We don't see that anymore. So this is definitely also like an aesthetic that really leans on the neo-Nazi aesthetic of the 90s. People like are putting up pictures and selfies without censoring their own pictures. People post photos or videos of friend groups where the entire friend group might be part of the neo-Nazi scene. And a lot of times people really just put up this content on one's own private personal profiles that are otherwise maybe apolitical, but where you essentially clearly signal that you are like someone who participates in these neo-Nazi protests, and that's something where like a type of content that also has a lot more reach than regular apolitical stuff.
So these people are young, they're usually male, they're willing to commit violence. You can see that, we could see that last year, the attack on SPD politician Matthias Recke, but then also election helpers. And this year, for the first time in a long time, one of the neo-Nazis of these youth groups was convicted. He was actually seen again this weekend in Halle, so he's not in prison yet. At the same time, we saw young neo-Nazis that attacked LKA staff in Berlin. Half of the people that were taken into custody were underage. You can see the potential for violence here. An anti-fascist watch blog published this video of a supposed member of Jung und Stark firing handguns. So concerning developments here, we see people sometimes that are from right-wing extremist families, but not only that, and they are sometimes already organized in youth groups of the tiny right-wing parties like Dritte Weg, but also AfD and NPD. So what we see is that the groups get stronger, but also they're growing the infrastructure and professionalize it. I want to show you an example. In August last year, a website popped up. It was a bit prototypical, lots of placeholder images, but it was clear where the journey was going. They wanted to create a website for bringing people together and motivate people for events. They also wanted to sell merch, starting with placeholders, but then very quickly they actually had merchandise available. Target audience is clearly neo-Nazis that want to target left-wing people. Also selling this, the important tools like mouth guards and quotes, to defend your hotspot. The violence has to go to the street. So the targeting is very clear. You can also see these mobilization videos, propaganda videos of the people. There's martial arts trainings where people film themselves. And the contact form also says you're either part of the movement or you're in the way. So you think that might be enough of a threat, but actually the threat is much larger, especially in the part of right-wing extremism. And we're dealing with a theory of militant accelerationism. What does that mean? It means that there's members of communities that are convinced that the democratic society is close to collapse, and that have a basic anti-Semitic and anti-democratic view of the world. So they believe that there's no political changes in the parliamentary system, but the only way to change this collapse, to prevent this collapse, is either by sharpening polarized debates or through violence in any form, especially terrorist attacks. So the goal should be to lead to bring forth this collapse, which in turn will lead to a race war, which will then yield in a form of society that's following National Socialist ideals. The idea is pretty abstract, and they're not they're not looking at that idea too closely. They just want to create the environment that makes this collapse possible. That's especially deadly, not just internationally, but also in Germany. The Halle attacks, the synagogue attacks in 2019, the perpetrator was well connected in internet societies. We also had the Atomwaffendivision attacks in Sweden, and a young man was taken into custody in Germany who wanted to create bombs. We had the same thing with the Feuerkrieg-Division. We had Saxon separatists that was supposedly in contact with international military accelerationists, including organizations following the Atomwaffendivision. So there is a threat that stems from these groups, but people from within these communities also commit violence as individuals, not as part of the group. And the perpetrators are mostly very young. We see a 16-year-old that has now been convicted that tried to build bombs and has done some test explosives. There's a 13-year-old that's currently being investigated. And we see also in our data set, we look at right-wing terror cases since 2016. There's been a huge amount of cases that we can assign to the militant accelerationism. And that shows again that it's urgent. That's something we urgently need to deal about, and that it's dangerous. The network is internationally organized. It's available on multiple platforms. One of the platforms that's always in the media is Telegram. Some people already started calling it Terrorgram because it's so present. We've done a study trying to identify users that at least seem to have a German relation to Germany. And last week, as of last week, we could have identified 688 users that we can assign as that we can find as Germans. 88 of these are heavy users with very high activity, but we can also see a rapid radicalization within the chat groups. Part of that is due to the community building in chat groups. People talk about private issues, talk about how their how their workouts go, what their social problems are, how things go in school. But here's also an excerpt that people say, I'm surprised that I passed the English test in school. But then at the same time, they talk about terror attacks. They distribute pamphlets and manuscripts that then say, okay, how do you best prepare and conduct terrorist attacks, how to best kill people. And the admin of this group say, for example, that he's been interrogated by the FBI due to his activities and talks about the 3-hour interrogation. But what we can also see is that the investigative pressure has had effects on the network. They now need new dynamics to move them into more private channels, to other platforms. Maybe some people have seen this is not a Telegram group screenshot. This is actually a screenshot from a Signal group. So far, so bad. But in the latest years, we have even newer phenomena that make us worry. Short reference back to militant accelerationism. It's about the same idea, but here they've moved away from this vision of the race war. It's not about building a future. It's just about leading, immanentizing the societal collapse. So this is part of what's now being called as nihilistic violence extremism. This NVE includes a network of different communities, and that includes very different target areas. Some are some doing sextortion crime, so extortioning people with either AI fakes or grooming underage people, cybercrime, like carding, but also offline crime. So committing crimes, murders in real life to gain credibility with the community. And a commonality here is hate for society, a general nihilistic approach to life. There's a lot of young people, young men especially, that are active there, and you can see that they're looking for recognition, for ways to exert power through violence or sexual exploitation of others. And this is based on basically neo-Nazi and esoteric ideas about the world. So generally speaking, nihilistic violence is not free of ideology, which we can see that the aesthetics, tactics, and also strategies are taken from militant accelerationism. We see a growth of cases worldwide. A 17-year-old German in 2022 murdered a old woman to become part of such a community. So it's sort of a recruitment tool. A few days before, he's already tried to murder an older man. At the same time, we see a 14-year-old that films himself while stabbing an old woman, attempted murder. And we see internationally there's more warnings from investigative authorities. So this is not a small problem anymore. All parts of the FBI, for example, are now reporting acts of violence and are investigating this in more than 250 cases. In the UK, teenagers from this community are already being convicted. A Georgian is currently investigated because he's supposed to have planned acts of terror in New York. And even Europol is now warning about online cult communities. In Germany, there's no comparable warning so far. But also here we see that networks are active. We see that the graffitis are showing up in the public sphere. Connections to a group that calls themselves No Lives Matter, that is clearly assigned to the militant accelerationist sphere. So we can't really say how big the problem is at this point, but we believe that in the coming years we're going to encounter it more and more, and that's pretty worrying.
So, yeah, people, underage people, as extremists, the question is like, how do they enter this process of radicalization? So, how do they even, like, how did this process start that ended with planning actual terror attacks? So, one question that we've looked into a lot. So, one is far-right gaming. You always have to put like a warning here if you put far-right games on a slide. But what we definitely observe is that I also love gaming, but there are definitely problems in gaming. So one important part is gaming as like a space for socialization. People meet young people, like children meet new people, and they obviously also like find new friends, but they also meet far-right extremists. One reason is that there is very little moderation, even though there's been improvements in the recent past. Another factor is that, of course, at least young people who have maybe a lot of problems at home also have like a strong drive towards escapism and find an outlet for that in gaming and are at a higher risk of being contacted by far-right extremists. Often people have this idea that there are grown-ups that are trying to groom children. That's something that we also observe in like single incidents, but primarily it's kind of more the 13-year-old radicalizing a 10-year-old. One thing that we also specifically noticed is Roblox, which is like not a game itself, but a platform where you can create like your own games and people kind of make simulations of terror attacks, but you can essentially create your own worlds and own games. To demonstrate this, like specifically, like to illustrate this with an example case, there was a group that essentially played a terror group on Roblox, and I found this on Telegram, and then someone said on Telegram, "Oh, like that's so embarrassing." That's so embarrassing to like essentially LARP terror. And then someone answered, "Oh, we used to do that, but then we moved to Telegram," and that ended with saying like, "Oh, and now we are men." That's very telling. All of these people were underage. Another example is that people were essentially had like a vote on Discord of whether they wanted to become like a real terror group now. Or not, and then they opened a Telegram group. The leader ordered bomb-making materials, and then he was arrested and sentenced to 3 years in prison. So that's something that that's how fast this route from playful terrorism, quote unquote, to real terrorism can go. Discord also like a platform that is known for gaming, but also very useful as a platform for different communities. Lots of different communities entered Discord during the pandemic, and far-right groups are also active on there, and it's definitely also like a platform where children get in touch with far-right extremists. But why now? Because a lot of these things have existed for a while, and what can we do against this? So first, we have this question a lot. We had the pandemic, and now we have more Nazis, but what happened in between? In research, when I speak to lots of other colleagues, we talk about a COVID blender, where during the pandemic, a lot of things came together that essentially were mutually reinforcing. That's not actually that surprising, because if you look at history, you could have already known that we know that after pandemics, social tensions tend to increase. That's for one, because during the pandemic, that's like the core topic. All other conflicts are essentially pushed back, but then return with a vengeance after the pandemic. And then, of course, the pandemic also reinforces and further strengthens existing tensions and conflicts. Then in addition to that, we don't just have the pandemic, but this phenomenon of a polycrisis, so multiple crises at the same time that reinforce and influence each other. Then there's a crisis of masculinity, because when we talk about these people, then we are speaking primarily of boys, so masculinity. And then in various rural areas, especially in East Germany, but not only, there's been like a developing far-right youth culture where it is cool to be a Nazi. What should we do? So for one, there definitely needs to be counter movements from security agencies and the platform. So they need to take action against this. So for example, when you look at seeing this, when you see these groups on WhatsApp, it's very clear that they don't fear blocking or persecution. But that's very much like a direct consequence of Meta doing less content moderation. I also have way fewer contacts at Meta when it comes to reporting these groups, so they can find themselves and essentially continue on WhatsApp. The problem with this that we have right now, that also when security agencies get involved, that this question of victims and perpetrators gets very complicated, because a 12-year-old who is a member of right extremist groups, I would primarily in the first instance describe this boy as a victim. Obviously, if he commits a crime, then he is also a perpetrator, but it makes these things a lot more complicated. But if we actually want to solve this problem, then it's not enough to just simply, this is simply not enough to look at it this simply. But a core question is also where does the demand for these things come from? And if I look at this work in the past 10 years, then I would say there are at least two things in the last 10 years. So a lack of communities. We live in a more and more fragmented community. People need these communities, and then they essentially find it online in these groups. And the other is a lack of sense-making narratives. So there is no longer this strong shared societal narrative of why are we doing this? Because our society essentially offers labor and work, but essentially finding a point in life through work is not something that a lot of is accessible to everyone. But this is something these groups are creating a sense, giving a purpose to life by becoming members of these groups. And I think that's really sad, because a drive towards community and finding a purpose and sense in life is something that are really important human drives, and I think that's something where we really need to have larger discussions and societal debates. Obviously, it's difficult to simply recreate communities from the ground up, because that needs investment, because we need spaces where you can meet again, but that also needs to happen online. During the pandemic, we saw that there was money invested into continuing and supporting culture online, but we essentially kind of just put underage people online, and then we're so now find something to do where we didn't really have any offer them anything. But there are things for example, we have football, that's something that's supported by the government. We could do the same thing online, right? We could have for example, gaming tournaments or conventions. And I think that's where we really need to find ways of really finding counter narratives, rather than just deleting these things from the internet and arresting underage children. So thank you so much for listening.